Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Well, first of all, my name is Dr. Nikki Floyd. I am the Director of Inspire Leading and Learning, and I'm thrilled to host today's webinar for inspirational and informative information. And the webinar title today is Teaching Culture 365, Educators Integrating Culture into Daily Teaching Practices. Next slide, please. Both Inspire and Harmony host these webinars where thought leaders and educators share best teaching practices and tools to support social emotional learning. These presentations are opinions and contents of our guest speakers and may not necessarily be a direct representation of Harmony and Inspire. For best viewing of this webinar, it is recommended that you shut down your other browsers. Throughout today's discussion, we hope to make this conversation among our panelists and all of you. Please use the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel to submit questions, comments, or ponderings for our guest. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and you will receive a copy of the webinar within the next week. If you're watching this webinar live, you'll receive a copy of the certificate of completion from GoToWebinar within 48 hours. You can also download a copy of the slide deck today under the handout tab on your GoToWebinar panel. Next slide, please. I would like to share the objectives of our webinar with you. So we hope today that you will dive deeper into why it's important to include culture in daily teaching practices, explore ways to implement culture in a set curricula, hear examples of how resources from Harmony SEL can be integrated while teaching culture, and then learning about professional learning resources through Inspire to further your cultural proficiency. Next slide, please. So we would like to start this out with a poll to see who's in the audience today. So if you guys can tell us where you're from, where you're located, that'll be fantastic. If you're a school leader, a teacher, out-of-school provider, a nonprofit, or higher education faculty. So there should be a quick poll on your screen. If you can just select that, and then we can read off some of that information for our guests today. Amanda, do we have any polls coming through?
Yeah, we have a great group today. Let's give everyone one more minute to respond. But looks like the majority are pre-K through 12th grade teachers as well as nonprofit staff. Looks like 80% have voted, so we can go ahead and close the poll.
All right, thank you. It's so nice to have educators here. Wow, 60% of the group is that. Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you for those who participated in that poll. I'm so happy that you guys are here today, and we're so excited to get in. I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. January Vance. Dr. January Vance has over 25 years of experience in urban pre-K schools, higher education, and policy agencies. She's held positions as a teacher, administrator, assistant professor, director, supervisor of student teachers, program manager, and consultant. Her research interests includes mentoring, urban teacher education, and leadership. I take this moment to welcome Dr. Vance to the screen for us to guide the conversation with our panelists today. Nice to have you, Dr. Vance.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to give a special thank you for serving as your moderator during the panel session today. At this time, we would like to ask our panelists, Dr. Ballard, Dr. Jackson, and Ms. Do Kim to introduce themselves.
I'll go first. Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Ballard. I'm currently an educational program manager at Achievement First University Prep. In this position, I support students in grades 9 through 11 with helping them with their pre-college experience. So that means I help students find pre-college opportunities throughout the school year, internship opportunities, and also enrichment opportunities throughout the school year. And one of my main goals is also to partner with different schools such as Columbia, Brown, Cornell, just to name a few. And basically the goal of the program is to help students prepare for college or a CTE program before actually starting the college post-secondary program. So thank you so much for having me here.
Okay, Dr. Jackson. Oh, whoever.
Go ahead, Ms. Kim. All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Do Kim, pronouns she, her, hers. I am currently the Director of Leadership Programs at Unbound Ed. We work with schools and districts, from teachers, coaches to district leaders, system leaders, and design professional learning for them so that we can really work to have all children have access to and experience grade level, engaging, affirming, and meaningful instruction. Prior to my work at Unbound Ed, I spent many years in the schools as a classroom teacher, coach, dean of curriculum and instruction, assistant principal, and I've really dedicated myself to the work of systemic sustained change in education. So that all of our children receive high quality learning and care, because hashtag little humans become big humans. And I am thrilled and honored to be in this space with everyone to engage in the importance of redefining, reimagining the meaning of culture and what that looks like in the practice of teaching.
Good afternoon. I'm James Jackson, Professor of Special Education here at Howard. I have over 30 years of working in special ed in multiple areas, with an expertise in working with children with behavioral disorders and emotional issues. Using my background as an artist and performer, I'm here because I'm interested in making sure that the teachers that I interface with have skills that will allow them to educate all children and not allow their issues of bias getting in the way. If it were not for two teachers that influenced me heavily in the 6th grade as well as the 7th grade, I'm not sure if I would be with you today. Those two individuals really took a child who was very troubled and altered his life using the arts so that he could see the possibilities and not become a victim of violence, death, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really glad that you're here, because I want to talk to you from my own experience in terms of what you can do to help enhance your skills and trying to be more culturally appropriate when we're talking about educating children. So thank you for allowing me this opportunity to share with you my thoughts and issues around culture and how it could be utilized well in the classroom setting. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for those great introductions. We'll go ahead and get started with our questions for the evening. The first question is, what is your definition of culture, and why is culture important in the practice of teaching? We'd like you to give examples and maybe certain or specific experiences. You'll each have 1 to 4 minutes to answer. Let's start with Dr. Ballard, then Ms. Do Kim, and then Dr. Jackson.
Okay, so for me, excuse me, culture is a representation of morals, values, and beliefs that is, for me, that is passed down from generation to generation. I do believe culture balances how one individual's lives and their perspectives and how they look at others. I do believe culture is vital within the school community, specifically within a classroom setting, because it only gives students and teachers the ability to understand one person's belief, their attitudes, and also learning how to communicate and interact with different racial and ethnic groups within the classroom. And two of my examples, so for me, currently in working in a high school setting, my students, I work in high school, grades 9 through 12. My students, the African community noticed that they did not have their own club. So the African students decided to start something to represent themselves. So at my school, we do have Black Girl Magic, we have Black Boy Joy, we have something for our Latinx students, but there wasn't something in particular for our African students. So for students such as Ghana, Nigeria, and Mali. So for me, in my school, my students are very self-aware of where they came from, and they wanted to show where they come from to the school community. So currently, that club is being designed at our school, and they have around about 45 members within our school building. And my second example for culture, I am currently a first generation Ghanaian American and a former school counselor for about 9 years. And I believe within my experience as a school counselor, but African parents in the school community felt more comfortable talking to me, sharing their concerns with me because I was able to relate to them. I was able to relate to their experiences, to their child's experiences, and also to their own beliefs and values. And I believe me being in this particular setting, I'm learning to be more open-minded, to not just work with only African parents. I'm learning to be more diverse and empathetic to working with all cultures within my school building. And I think for me, I'm also learning now supporting other teachers build that connection. Like, you cannot just work with one particular race, but you do have to be open and be willing to learn how to communicate and connect with other stakeholders, students, and teachers.
Thank you. Ms.
So,
Kim?
yes, a lot of what you said, Dr. Ballard, resonated with me, especially how culture really plays a part in perspective, how you show up. Culture to me is the framework around which we build our identity. So wherever we come from, there is a culture that follows us from that place. No matter where you grow up, where you go, your culture will always be something you can take with you. It is a lived experience unique to each individual, and it's fluid and multifaceted. It's influenced by social, economic, and political factors too, right? So in that regard, culture can't be defined with stagnant characteristics or surface structures like food, festivals, holidays, which often are the things that get amplified when we celebrate different cultures. When we're talking about the inclusion of culture in our practice of teaching, we really need to consider context and positionality because teaching and learning is contextual and a situational process. Learning becomes more meaningful and more likely to take place when academic knowledge is situated within the cultural and social backgrounds of our students. And this is, to Dr. Ballard's point, because our culture influences how we engage with the world, the perspectives we take, the expectations we have, and it is our job as educators and as humans to ensure that we don't neglect a major aspect of a student's identity, that we foster an environment where differences are accepted and understood, particularly if those differences have historically been ignored or disparaged. In the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire explained that a person learns to read the world much earlier than he learns to read the word. So in other words, the backgrounds and experiences that students bring with them to the classroom are an integral part of this world, the world being one's first experiences within the context of one's culture. And this world cannot be separated from the learners because it really influences how they understand and make sense of themselves and everyone and everything around them. This culture as the framework around which we build our identity is so important to me because growing up as one of the only, oftentimes, or maybe just a few Korean Americans in my classroom full of other white classmates, I very much felt, whether it was highlighted almost on show or display, when we talked about when we read maybe the one Asian folktale in class, talking about what we wore during Culture Day, where we celebrate different traditional clothing. I wore my hanbok, and all of that felt so superficially odd to me, right? Because that's not really just who I am. There's so much more. And so, it's really important to me in working with educators that we are affirming our students in all of the intersectional identities that come along with it, not just what we eat, what we wear, the language we speak, even though that is a part of it.
Dr. Kim, Dr. Kim, I don't have very much to add to what you were saying because you basically said everything that I wanted to say in the sense that culture is not static, it's dynamic. And as a person who's been teaching in the area of special education for over 30 years, oftentimes when we talk about culture, we often think of it in terms of race and the ethnic origins. but it's much larger than that. It's much more expansive than that. And so we have to start thinking about, as teachers, how do we want to create the world in which our children will thrive? And so I'd like to just sort of suggest that, you know, we think about where we show up and how we show up. And I want to share with you, on the 19th of February, I read in my daily word, the word was aspire. And so the thought for the day was, I aspire to help create a world that works for all. And I think teachers are on the front lines in making sure that actually comes true by what you do in your classroom. Because when children show up, they want to see you as somebody who is there for them. They want to know, they want you to help them identify who they are, how they engage, how they can contribute, and then what can you do to help make all of these questions answerable. So to me, it's dynamic. It's about what we want to create for the world and how we want to make all children feel safe, comfortable, valued, affirmed, and believe in who they are as individuals and be able to contribute something no matter how they show up. Oftentimes we leave the students with disabilities out of this discussion. We leave other folks because of their difference out of this discussion. We have to be much more broader in the way we think about culture and what that represents, because it is non-static, it is dynamic, it's multi-layered. And so we cannot just operate anymore from that one perspective about what we think about culture. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Excellent insight on the definition of culture. We're going to move on to our next question, which is, what are perspectives we have on culture? We'll ask Ms. Kim if she can give us some insight.
Sure, thank you. So the culture that many students experience at home and in their communities is not always represented at school, or if it is, it may be represented in stereotypical ways. And often what we say is unitary concept, right? It's oversimplified and limited to a certain amount of days. Many schools tend to celebrate and teach different cultures during limited amounts of time, like right now, February, for example, is Black History Month. March is Women's History Month. We have AAPI and Latinx Heritage Months, Native American Heritage Months, but this really only emphasizes compartmentalizing of different cultures. And it implies, honestly, that cultures that are different from the dominant white culture are less than worthy and can only be displayed or talked about for limited amounts of time. I think I mentioned this before, we had the Culture Day at our school, years and years of this tradition, a day of food and fun celebrating all the cultures represented at the school. But to me, this kind of, what Dr. Jackson says, it's just stagnant take on culture poses 4 problems for me, right? So 1, it's touristy with its overly generalized, brief and limited glimpse at a culture, often reducing it to just a small composite of food, dress, and holidays. 2, it makes white culture the norm. When we have one day or 1 month in a whole year where we learn about world cultures, we reinforce the idea of them as exotic or strange. And we inadvertently send the message that Eurocentric white culture is the norm and that its practices are what's expected in the school environment. 3, I think another problem is that it's tokenistic. It's a superficial effort at inclusion under the guise of recognizing diversity. I read recently this quote that said, diversity is not the same thing as inclusion. Diversity invites people to the table, but inclusion empowers your voice to be heard while you're at the table. And this really resonated with me because teaching culture should be inclusive while our students are in our classroom year long, right? And then lastly, it perpetuates stereotypes. For example, when we celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month and the AAPI folks in May, we focus on the traditions of food and activities, but I think this perpetuates the stereotype of all Asians being alike and lumping them together again in a monolithic group, instead of highlighting the fact that AAPI consists of more than 50 ethnic groups with different cultures and histories in the United States. So each of those students will bring something new. And so this unitary concept makes me think of the question that Lisa Delpit raises: who is important? To me, cultural and intersectional identities are not mutually exclusive. My culture tells my story. It shapes my lens and how I show up in the world. And it's part of my identity. And when my identity is seen and heard and honored, I feel a sense of belonging, and I feel that I'm important. And I think I mentioned before, you know, growing up as a Korean American where I lived, I was often one of just a few or sometimes only Asian kid in the class. I definitely didn't feel seen. The model minority myth was present, and it definitely had a negative, had some negative consequences for me in my academic and identity development. And sure, on a surface level, the label appeared to be complimentary, but in reality, I found my voice silenced and my needs neglected by my teachers. It was very bizarre because I was praised for working silently and being good at math and getting good grades, but I was never really invited into answering classroom discussions or questions that probe thinking or offering opinion. And so it was this really odd tension of feeling exalted and ignored at the same time. And that, for the 8-year-old me, was really confusing and definitely not affirming. I silently soaked in the slurs, the gestures of slanting the eyes, because I felt that I shouldn't be Korean in the midst of the majority of white classmates, especially because there was nothing that affirmed that part of me. And the teachers didn't really do anything to address it. And looking back now and working with teachers, I know it's because of the support and the learning that needs to happen to help support the teachers. Back then, when we didn't have a lot of Asian representation in books, and Lunar New Year wasn't a celebrated holiday in schools, and until 4 decades ago, not having any Asian American characters be visible in children's books, or really the end of the 80s, if we're talking about accurate and authentic representation, right? And Asian characters that did appear in books published in the early years were full of stereotypes or stories that were inaccurate. All of that to say, teaching and embedding culture and not limiting it to designated days and months, but year round, will really allow our students' identities to be cultivated in a way where they can walk freely in the classroom and beyond without having to explain who they are, why they are, who their family is, where they came from. When Black history, Asian history, Latinx stories is a part of a full year's curriculum and full year's interaction between adult and child, with print, text, dialogue that represents those histories and those identities and those stories, we create more equitable classrooms and provide, especially for our marginalized students, with the affirmation that they are truly important, and space to explore history from varying perspectives, right? And with that, just think of how they might step up and show up into the real world later on as adults.
Hey, thank you all very much.
I think, and I would agree with Doe, because representation does matter. I remember growing up in the South in the Jim Crow era, and questioned why did I have to pass a school in my neighborhood which was white to go to the Black neighborhood where the Black school was. And it was a hard thing for a 6-year-old to think about. And then when you think about what I was exposed to in terms of my education, not seeing myself in the books that we were given, not hearing anybody talk about, the issues that were important to me, really made the difference. And so I came to surmise that students from all cultures need to see themselves in what you are teaching and why it's relevant to their lives. They need you to make connections with them. this has been difficult for some, as Doe suggested. This has been difficult for some kids because their history has been whitewashed, the history has been left out, and we still have these kinds of things happening now. And so it's going to be important for you all as educators to really stand up and decide, how do you want to position yourself as you talk about this thing related to culture, and how does that show up in what you do, not just, as Doe said, for the month of February, for the month of March, but how does it show up for the entire year, so that all these children, regardless of how they identify, can feel affirmed in your classroom and be able to contribute what they are capable of contributing without you putting them in a box.
Hey, excellent. Thank you very, very much.
You guys hear me?
Yes.
So if we can do like around the room of the panels, giving some different strategies educators can walk away with on how to infuse culture into the classroom, from either that's being a school counselor, a teacher, or administrator, or working in the nonprofit era. If we can all just do a whip around of some strategies they can walk away with, I think they'll be really impactful for our guest who's with us today.
I'd like to start. There's a much more extensive list, and I'll only deal with a couple because I don't want to take all the time. I want to share. But for me, one of the biggest strategies I think that needs to be put into place would be to have teachers investigate the biases that they bring to the table as it relates to the classroom. Because if you're uncomfortable with difference, then you're not going to be very successful. You have to open yourselves up to being able to demonstrate a level of authentic care, so that students can feel like they can connect with you. And if you have biases regarding differences, no matter how they show up, then you may not be able to touch the life of a child in a very positive way. Again, I want to underscore the importance of Mrs. Taylor and Mr. Johnson. Mrs. Taylor recognized in me a gift that I knew I had, but I didn't know I could use it in a way that would help enhance her classroom community. She knew I could sing, and she put me in a play. And that simple act, changed the trajectory of my behavior. Mr. Johnson, my 7th grade choral teacher, he was the first to take me out of the city to see something that I had not seen before. So being able to put yourself in a position where you don't carry your biases, and you show up in an authentic way, so that you want to impart what you can into the life of a child, you don't know how much that will follow that child for the rest of his or her life. And another thing, as you're doing that, take time to build relationships with your students so that you can engage in that authentic care that students desire. Ask yourself the question, if this were my child, what would I want to happen? What would I want someone to do? And if you can answer that question, I think you could move in many directions in terms of helping to embrace this idea of culture, no matter how different it shows up in your classroom. I'll stop and let somebody else join in.
Well, could I just piggyback off of what Dr. Jackson said really quick about just the anti-racist, anti-bias kind of mindset, because that's something that I've been thinking a lot about too. It starts with a reflection of our own cultural lens and biases. That is really where the hardest work is, and the most important work, but the work that often gets bypassed because we're trying to fix the culture in the classroom, right? And so, in my mind, I always think that, we really want to bring a critically reflective lens to our work as educators. So if you think about it, asking students to acknowledge cultural diversity and learning about different cultures in the absence of anti-racism and doing the work of being an anti-racist educator is also racist, right? So that is so important. And I thank you, Dr. Jackson, for elevating that, because I do think that that's where it starts. And I'll also pass it to Dr. Ballard.
Sorry, thank you for sharing. So I'll be talking from a school counselor perspective. So from my experience working with as a school counselor in grades K through 12, something that I'm very passionate about is building relationships with students and their families, no matter the race or ethnic diversity, right? So I think something how I've been very successful in making my school community safe, comfortable, fun, and everyone has acknowledged each other is actually building that relationship. And something that I've done in the past as a school counselor is actually holding a professional development on how to bridge that gap between classroom diversity, school diversity, and community. Once you do those things, once you get teacher buy-in, that is something that's really crucial. So I think for me, coming from a school counselor perspective, something that I've done in the past is sit with the leadership team at my school and also sit with the school principal, like, hey, these are some of the gaps that I've noticed at my school. These are some of the things I've heard from students and parents. What can we do as a school building? What can we do as a leadership team to make sure our students are being heard, seen, and making sure that they're being safe? Something else that I've done in the past is create a student survey for families and students to get their input on what they want to see in their school building. And for me, I love collecting data. And if you were able to do that in your school building, collecting that data and sharing it with the leadership team and the school principal will definitely be an eye opener on what the school really looks like. Yes, you can have 79% Latinx students in your school equals about 15% African American, but where's the gap where everyone could feel comfortable within their school building? And lastly, you want to push students out there outside their comfort zone. So like I said before, building relationships is critical, and it is key to making that school community what you want it to be, not just in your classroom, but overall in your school building. I still talk to students from 10 years ago because I challenged them to go to a 4-year college and not a 2-year school because their teacher said that they could only do this. So once you actually believe in your students and actually show up for your students and their families, that's a game changer. And that is what, for me, that's how I am a successful school counselor, because I took risk, I advocated for my students and their families, and I definitely made a change within culture, but also communicating all these ideas with teachers in my school building. Of course, working with teachers, there are teachers that are going to feel uncomfortable talking to a particular group or race or so forth. But once you actually sit down with different teachers in your school building that have those issues, and once you like connect that gap, teachers will be more open to learning about other students, right? They'll be more open about not like telling the Black teacher to go talk to the Black parents. And you know what I'm trying to say? So I think overall, as educators, we have to learn to be open-minded and empathetic, but also learning to be willing to learn from each other. That is the only way our school building could be successful.
I'd like to go ahead.
Go ahead,
Doe.
Dr. Jackson.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to offer some considerations from a teacher's perspective.
Go ahead. I was going to do the same.
Okay. I think, I know some of you may be using set or scripted curriculum. So, how do we practice culturally responsive teaching and culturally responsive social, emotional learning strategies with our children when we have this scripted curriculum and everything's outlined for us? I think the one important thing is to really recognize the importance of students' cultural references, affirm and support their identities, and view them as assets, and then intentionally incorporate the history and culture of students into the curriculum, because this is what's going to help build cultural competence in your students. And cultural competence promotes positive identity, and strong cultural identity promotes academic achievement and also builds up socio-emotional skills by allowing students to hold multiple perspectives and interact with each other with respect. So I know that that's hard when you're trying to place their culture, their language, their lived experiences all at the center of your instruction and within your classroom spaces. But really, you know, you raise these questions to yourselves and with your school leaders, you know, in the questions that I'm asking and who I'm calling to answer, whose voice is being heard? Who is represented in the texts and the read alouds? Do they include myriad voices and multiple ways of knowing, experiencing, and understanding life so that students can find and value their own voices, histories, and cultures? Who's represented in the physical space that's on your classroom walls? Right? How are your students' cultures and intersecting identities honored and celebrated throughout the year? When can you embed that read aloud? When can you embed some perspective that someone from another culture, a student from another different culture, can offer in response to some other, you know, critical discussion that you're having about the learning? And where in your scripted curriculum lesson plans can you incorporate questions that will empower your kids to interrogate and debate and discuss not just how they're thinking and why they're thinking that way, but what they're actually learning, right? The last thing I wanted to say is that in the classroom, culture has to carry the weight and complexity that it holds outside of the school walls. And that's why it's so important to embed it as much as you can for all your students every day, year long.
And I'd like to add that, you know, need to look at the way we are teaching. For years, I have been utilizing Rudolf Dreikas's work as it relates to democratic teaching. And because in that philosophy, he speaks about teachers serving as change agents via helping students to identify positive skills that they can utilize not only in the classroom, but also in the larger community. And so in that context, I would challenge each one of you to think about how you can show up in terms of creating a democratic classroom where all voices are respected, everybody gets a chance to participate. Yes, you may be the person in charge and you have the authority, but learn how to share your classroom with your students, because in my experience, some of my students have had much more experience than I have. Many of these children grow up being very responsible because they're coming from single family homes and they have to have multiple responsibilities. And being able to recognize that and use that strength to help you create the classroom dynamic would be a very positive thing. And that then leaves the child feeling like, okay, I've made a positive contribution. I may not be able to read well, but I've made a positive contribution. And if I keep making these positive contributions, I'm probably going to get somebody to help me with my reading so that I can be a better reader. There's so much more that you can gain from allowing students to show their strengths as opposed to you're focusing on their deficits. The other thing that I'd like to suggest to you is there's a guy who wrote a book about many strategies to manage a classroom. His name is Bianco. And he said that in many cases, when teachers are encountering students, they tend to use the authoritarian approach, and that they want to, they want students to be accountable. They want to then apply affirmations. They then want to move beyond the realm of, they want to move to the realm of acceptance. But he's saying, look, you need to think about it in the reverse. He says that you need to accept students no matter how they show up, and you accept them unconditionally, right? Then you say, I'm going to be accountable as your teacher to help you grow socially, emotionally, academically, and when it's appropriate, vocationally, all right? Then he says you ought to be thinking about affirming and saying to the students, I see you as a work in progress, and I will make considerable contributions to your well-being and your welfare and your growth. And then you say, as the authority figure, I will use my authority to advocate and be viewed as I will use my authority to advocate for you so that you can see that you are a valuable person in the world of this that we live in. Children need models. And if you're not modeling what you expect them to have in the school environment, in your class environment, and the larger community, then I'm not sure if your education is going to be worthwhile to these children. It's not going to be relevant. And then Dr. Doe and Dr. Ballard has already spoken about the positive nature of strength. I'd also like to ask you to think about the idea of how can you co-parent with these children's parents so that the parents know that you're invested in these kids, because you want to be with these kids 6 or 7 hours a day. And in reality, you are a surrogate parent. So you may as well take that a notch up a little bit and say, look, I'm your child's co-parent from 8 o'clock in the morning until 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We need to be talking about what we're doing so that we're both on the same page. These are things that I have used. These are things I continue to use as a university professor, because when students don't show up, I call. I ask questions. I take my students out to different places because I want to make sure that I'm contributing to the welfare of the whole child, not just the academic side. And if you're going to be working well with students, particularly those that are coming from urban environments, you're going to have to do multiple things, because these kids and all kids, I think, believe that until you demonstrate a level of care, they're not going to buy into you.
Now, I think it's so important, even from a teacher ed perspective, whenever we are grooming our student teachers going out into the field, we make sure that they're able to embrace those differences, those different cultures, those different areas of diversity. So I just wanted to thank you all for your comments, and we're going to at this time have Dr. Nikki to give us some connections to Inspire in Harmony at this time.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you guys to the panelists and the excellent perspective you guys brought to the discussion. But I do want to give our audience a chance to reflect. So I'm going to ask this question. What is one way culture is recognized or could be celebrated in your school or community? And you can use the question tab or the question box to respond to that, and then we'll be able to read out some of the responses when we get those in. But I am so excited and I'm so happy we had this discussion, because a lot of great points were elevated and brought into this space. And I think it's crucial for educators to hear, to have these conversations, so we go back into the spaces with children, that we're doing our due diligence in making sure that we're lifting up and elevating the spirit and the voice of children around this country. So I'm so happy that we had this conversation. Amanda, do we have any questions in the question tab, or any reflections or thoughts?
We're having great reflections coming through the question box. From Susan Green, the amount of deconditioning of who educators believe they are supposed to be in a child's life is no longer linear. Whole adults need to teach whole children in order to make this work.
Beautiful. Do we have time for one or two more, Amanda?
Yeah, a couple questions came through. A couple folks wanted to know the name of the book that Dr. Jackson mentioned. Do you have the name of that book on hand, Dr. Jackson?
Being the one that talks about the 100 ways to manage behaviors?
Yes.
No, but I can get it to you. I don't have the name right off, but I can get it to you.
That would be great.
Nikki, can I send it to you?
You sure can.
All right.
We have a couple other comments coming through. I teach culture through art. One way we recognize culture is by hosting an international food and culture festival. Someone else has commented, Vanessa's commented, I feel like everything gets so themed that it's difficult to celebrate cultural differences in a meaningful way, especially in elementary school. Others are just thanking you for your thoughts, thanking you for everything you've shared today. A few other questions that we can talk about when we get to the question section, but everyone is so honored to hear your reflections today and inspired by your thoughts.
Thank you so much. All right, next slide, Amanda. I don't think it's moved just yet. All right, there we go. So here, first of all, thank you guys for joining this conversation. Here at Stanford Education Programs, we have two programs. One is called Inspire, and Inspire focuses on teacher relationships with students and inspiring all students to be their best. And we have strategies to help teachers and inspire students whose cultures or backgrounds may be different from your own, and we highlight inclusive classroom environments and connecting students to their own culture and own learning by highlighting diverse cultures. And we do this through various professional development that is online. It can be asynchronous, or actually have coach and mentor modules as well to work actually in the space of understanding how to work with your students from a different lens. And we have an entire unit as well on cultural competencies, as well as social emotional learning, social emotional health, as well as standard teaching practices. So if you really enjoyed this conversation from our panelists, I implore you to check out the Inspire modules and Inspire curricula to see what can you pull and use to help elevate the identity and culture work you do as an educator in that space. Next slide, please. In addition to Inspire, we also have Harmony, which is a program for our students. And Harmony really focuses on the social and emotional health of students. So if you're thinking about this culture conversation, thinking about how students' culture may not be represented in a classroom, what is that doing to their social emotional health? This is where Harmony can come in. We have everyday teaching practices that really focus on building community, activities, support harmonious peer relationship students. And then we have certain units that really highlight that can help you support this work with being my best self, valuing each other, communicating with each other, then learning from each other. And there's stories, there's storybooks, there's conversation cards, and all of this can really help you start the conversations in your classrooms for students to feel that their voices are welcomed, and we can do this year round. Much like Ms. Kim said, where it's not just celebrated in a particular moment where it feels performative, where we really can use these resources to help us elevate this language and this spirit and these conversations year round in our classrooms. So we can move to the next slide, please. We want to provide a chance to ask some follow-up questions from our panelists. There's their emails down below as well, but we're going to stop sharing screen and they're going to come back on screen so you actually can hear from them and be able to speak with them as well. So any question that you may have for our panelists, you can drop those in the question box and then we'll read those off in the time we have left.
Yes, we've had some great questions come through. There are a couple questions about literature you recommend for addressing cultural topics and bringing different cultures into the classroom. So is there a resource that you recommend that educators can turn to find the diverse literature for the classrooms?
I have a book from my literacy course that outlines a number of books for young children that can be used to enhance this discussion about culture and differences. I'll be happy to share that with you. Nikki, I could get that to you by the early part of next week.
That works.
And I'll add some additional things because I'm doing a webinar on grief, and it speaks to what teachers and parents can do. So I'll include books around grief as well as other items that will address social emotional learning.
I think Ms. Kim, you're about to say something as well?
Oh, I was going to say a really good book source to go through because they vetted it is We Need Diverse Books. And there is also another one that, let me see. If you go just for statistics as a teacher or an educator, just to see statistics around who is represented and what kind of children's literature is out there, there is a good website that you can go to. It's called wordsrated.com. But We Need Diverse Books is one that I know that they look at the research, the representation, the authenticity of the stories, and they list books by grade level, grade band, by genre, all of that.
I can have two resources. The first book is called Just Ask. It's for K through 4. If you're like doing small group or group setting as a school counselor, that is a great book to bring culture and diversity into your classroom if you're doing any school counseling lessons. And another one is called ASCA, is the American Associations for School Counselor. They have tons of resources on culture competency as for school counselors and how to push it in your classroom. So those are two great resources that you can use.
And I was able to find the book that I was speaking to about the discipline issues. It is called 1 Minute Discipline Techniques, Classroom Management. It's by Arnie Bianco, B-I-N-C-O. And if you go to Thrift Books, you can get it for $4.79.
We have another good question. In schools that have clubs that are culture specific, should they welcome others of various cultures in order to learn about the culture, or should they be closed to those who are part of that culture? The reason I ask is I can see the benefit of having a connection with the community, but I also feel it's important for others to learn about the various cultures.
Absolutely.
I can also share. I also think for me, like some of my clubs at my school are, ethnic or rate, just subject to like a particular group. But within our school community, like students have been signing up to like participate in other cultures. So for Black Girl Magic, we do have some Latina students within that group because number one, they want to feel welcome, they want to learn about the history, but they also want to feel a part of community as well. So say for example, if during Black History Month we had a show, and majority of our students, for a fun fact, majority of the students that participated in the Black History Month show were the Latina girls because they wanted to learn about Afrobeats, they wanted to learn about reggae. So I believe these clubs should be open to all because, of course, number one, we want to make sure our students are safe, but we also want to make sure our students are diverse and are being open to learning. So the fact that they even want to join a particular club that's not their race is a game changer.
Mhm.
And the other thing too is sometimes because a child is of a certain race doesn't mean that he or she is identifying with that race.
Mhm.
And so I think that's another valuable reason why we should have open membership to no matter what type of club it is, because, I had a student here at Howard once. She was a young Black woman, but her parents had socialized her to be white. And so she was afraid of Black people. And so we gotta start thinking about, again, those cross boundaries, because just because someone identifies a certain way doesn't mean that that person really, really identifies with that person, with that group.
Right.
All right, Amanda, do we have time for one more question?
There's just a question. What was the second resource Ms. Kim mentioned?
It's wordsrated.com. Let me just make sure. Yeah, Words Rated.
So there was a comment, maybe you can respond to this. I feel like everything gets so themed that it's difficult to celebrate cultural differences in a meaningful way, especially in elementary school. So any final recommendations for just making sure it's meaningful and not in that box?
As a practicing educator, my thing is focus on it from a human perspective. And if you can celebrate humanity, then I think you can include culture naturally. Don't isolate kids because of their differences. Include them and let your students talk freely about the differences that show up in your classroom, because I think they learn a lot from each other. So accept them as human beings, allow the humanity to show. You respond to the humanity using various strategies that you would employ with any child, and allow students a chance to discuss among themselves because they learn a lot from each other.
Mhm.
And I think I want to take it back to, the culture as not mutually exclusive from our identities, right? Whether they're intersectional, what have you, because I think, yes, honoring the humanity and honoring the students as individuals and authentic little human beings will naturally be embedding, right, culture. I think one of the misconceptions is that culture is all about like the themed things, right? And so what we want to do is prioritize culture as our students' identities. And in elementary school, a lot of the conversations that happen between the kids that you overhear will automatically lead to like being able to have discussions around differences, different perspectives, respect, seeing each other for who they are, regardless of, background, all the other things.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for all those questions. Again, thank you to our panelists. I did want to mention one more book. It's by Christopher Emdin. The title is called For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood and Everyone Else Too. That book is really helpful for helping educators understand how to let the students invite you into the cultural space, and then you working inside of those parameters with the students based on them supporting you and learning about their culture as well. So again, thank you for all our questions for our panelists. Next slide, please, Amanda. One more, next slide, we're gonna skip that, we're running short on time. All right, so we have another webinar coming up. It's on SEL Day, Social Emotional Learning Day, called Uplifting Hearts and Connecting Minds. It's Thursday, March 9th, 2023, from 1 to 2 Pacific Standard Time, and then from 4 to 5 Eastern Time. And you are able to register now for that particular webinar. And if you register today, you'll receive a free complimentary Z from us. We'll get that shipped out to you as well. And our next slide, please. I just want to thank you guys for all joining us today and taking your time out of your busy schedules to hear about the value of bringing culture into everything you do. Once this webinar comes to a close, a survey will be launched to your screen. It's very short, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback. We do read your feedback and take your responses seriously. To this day, your responses have helped building more successful webinars. We also encourage you to connect with us on our socials and with our programs here at Inspire and at Harmony. And again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the attendees who joined this impactful conversation. I hope you guys took away some great information, some great thoughts. Have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.